Astute Michael Hayes stood at the edge of the shuttle's loading ramps, staring out at the alien world. Before him, the planet was a mass of rugged terrain stretching as far as the eye could see in every direction, a far cry from the lush gardens and marble halls of the diplomatic venues he'd expected to visit. But then again, he wasn't here for the view, he was here to protect Princess Nyla, the one person who could tip the balance of peace between three warring factions in the galaxy. He didn't like it not one bit, the political games, the endless scheming, the manipulation. It made his skin crawl. The princess was no better than the others from the moment they met. Her cold, regal demeanor had rubbed him the wrong way. Her arrogance made her look more like a spoiled brat than a ruler in the making. He didn't care about her heritage or her royal title. She was just another person who needed protection, someone to guard with his life, if necessary, but that didn't mean he had to like her. The princess herself was already halfway down the ramp, her long silver hair flowing behind her like a shimmering veil, her violet eyes scanning the surroundings with a disinterest that spoke volumes about how little she cared for this mission or for the people around her. Her posture was perfect, every step precise, as if she was still walking through a royal ballroom, even though they were on the edge of a desolate planet, waiting for a transport that would take them to the Peace Summit. Michael followed a few steps behind, keeping his distance, as they made their way toward the outpost where they'd be staying for the next few days. The place was nothing more than a crumbling stone structure half buried in the rocky terrain, but it would do the job. It would protect them from the elements and provide some semblance of safety if the negotiations went south. Not that he was expecting any trouble. The factions had their reasons to come to the table, but in his experience things never went according to plan. Inside the outpost was as sparse as the outside, a few old tables and chairs, nothing extravagant, just functional. But that was fine with Michael. It was more than enough for the two of them. He glanced at the princess as she took a seat at one of the tables, her eyes already scanning the data pad she'd been clutching. Since they left the shuttle, he shook his head and set his gear down on the floor. A few moments later, the door burst open and the local contact they were supposed to meet appeared, grinning ear to ear, as if he hadn't just escorted them to one of the most dangerous places in the galaxy. The peace talks were in trouble, and this outpost was supposed to be a safe house, but Michael wasn't buying it. He studied the man, carefully watching for any signs of deception. The contact wasn't here just to bring them to safety. There was something else going on, something bigger. But before he could say anything, the ground shook beneath them, the sound of heavy explosions ripping through the atmosphere echoing from above. The princess jumped to her feet, her face paling with sudden realization. The attack had come from nowhere, and Michael's heart raced. He reached for his weapon instinctively, but before he could make a move, the door slammed shut with a deafening clang, and the lights flickered out, plunging them into darkness. The darkness swallowed them whole, a suffocating blackness that left Michael's senses on high alert. His hand instinctively went to his side, where his sidearm was holstered, but he hesitated for a moment. He could hear Nyla's breath quicken beside him, the unmistakable sound of her own fear, but she was trying to hide it, her back straight as always, her regal composure holding fast, despite the chaos outside. Michael cursed under his breath as his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls and ceiling. The explosions above had stopped, but the tremors continued, shaking the outpost with each passing seconds. Something big was happening, and it was only a matter of time before the attackers found their way inside. The princess spoke, then, her voice low but steady, like she was giving orders, as if everything would be fine. She demanded to know what was going on. Her eyes narrowed in the dark, her expression a mixture of confusion and anger. Michael turned toward her, his words curt and direct as he assessed the situation. "We're under attack," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Whoever they are, they're here for something, and we're in the middle of it." Nyla didn't flinch. Instead, she stood up straight, her movements deliberate, as if she was calculating her next move. "I demand an explanation immediately. This is unacceptable. We were supposed to be safe here." Michael's eyes narrowed as he took a step closer. "This isn't a diplomatic meeting, Your Highness. This is war, and your people are not as safe as you think." She ignored the bite in his words and instead scanned the room with a piercing gaze, as if searching for any hidden weapons or escape routes. Michael couldn't help but be impressed by her focus. She wasn't just a princess, she was a survivor in her own right. "Do we have a way out of here?" she asked, her tone more controlled now. Michael considered the question for a moment. It wasn't an easy one to answer. The outpost had no escape routes that he could see. The only way out was through the front doors. But with the attackers closing in, that wasn't an option anymore. "No," he said after a long pause, "not unless we fight our way out, and even then it's a gamble." Leora seemed to contemplate his words for a moment before giving a quick nod, her face hardening with determination. "Then we fight," she said with surprising conviction. Michael stared at her for a beat, surprised by the resolve in her voice. But there was no time to waste. He knew they needed to act quickly if they were going to survive. "All right," he said with a sigh of resignation. "We'll need to barricade the doors and secure the room, but we don't have much time." Without waiting for a response, he moved quickly to the closest table and began to push it toward the door. As Leora followed his lead, she grabbed anything she could find to help reinforce their defenses. Her movements, quick and efficient, far more capable than he had expected. Once the door was barricaded, Michael turned to face her and saw something in her eyes, something different. It wasn't the coldness he'd seen before or the detached royalty. It was the look of someone who had been forced to confront the reality of their situation. Someone who understood the stakes now. They weren't just a princess and a soldier. They were two people trying to survive in a world that had suddenly turned hostile. He nodded at her, not speaking, but his respect for her had grown just a little bit more. She wasn't backing down, she was stepping up, and that was something Michael hadn't anticipated from someone like her. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. The mercenaries were getting closer. Michael's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm. The tension in the air was thick, but the princess beside him was now focused on the task at hand, as if she had fully embraced the danger around them. It was a stark contrast to the haughty royal she'd been earlier. The change in her was palpable, and Michael couldn't deny that he respected her for it. He motioned for Leora to stay low as he crept toward the window, a small slit between the crumbling stone that offered a view of the rocky landscape outside. He peered through, but couldn't see anything yet. The night had fallen fast, and the shadows were long, but he could hear the movement outside, a few voices muttering, but nothing distinct enough to pinpoint their exact location. "They're coming," Michael whispered back to Leora, his voice steady despite the rising adrenaline. Leora nodded without saying a word, her face serious, her once immaculate clothes now dirtied and torn from the explosions and the frantic movement inside the outpost. She didn't seem to care, though her focus remained sharp, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the room for any possible threats. Michael took a deep breath and turned to face her. "We need to get out of here," he said, his tone firm. "If we stay here, they'll eventually get in. We won't last long." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable for a moment before she responded, her voice low but steady. "I won't leave, not without getting what I came here for." Michael was taken aback. He had expected her to panic or at least express some fear, but there was nothing in her words or demeanor that showed any weakness. Instead, she was resolute, almost defiant in the face of certain danger. It was both maddening and admirable, but it also made his job that much harder. He had to protect her, but she wasn't making it easy. "I'm not here for a political game, Princess," he said, his frustration creeping into his voice. "You want to play hero, go ahead, but I'm getting you out of here alive, whether you like it or not." For a moment, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something softer, before she regained her composure and nodded slightly. "I understand, but I still have a duty here, Michael. I can't walk away without trying." Michael stared at her, trying to read her face, but it was hard to see through the mask. She wore the mask of a leader, someone who had been trained for this life, someone who understood the weight of responsibility, but also the weight of sacrifice. He clenched his jaw, but didn't argue with her. He knew better than to try to change someone's mind when it was made up. "Fine," he muttered. "We'll do it your way, but we move quickly, and we stick together, got it?" Leora gave a small nod, her gaze never leaving him, as if measuring his every word before she spoke again, her voice just above a whisper. "Where do we go?" Michael paused for a moment, considering their options. The front door was out of the question. The attackers were already closing in on it. They would never make it that way. Their best bet was the old maintenance tunnel he'd spotted earlier. It was hidden behind a false wall at the far end of the outpost, but it wasn't a perfect plan. It was a long shot at best, and they would be exposed for a good stretch of the journey. Back through the maintenance tunnel, he said finally, his eyes locking onto hers. It's our best chance. Leora didn't hesitate this time. She simply nodded and began to move toward the back of the room where Michael had pointed to the false wall. They had to work quickly before the mercenaries reached the main building, and they lost their only opportunity to escape. As they approached the wall, Michael could hear the sounds of the mercenaries' voices growing louder outside. They were getting closer, and his stomach, twisted with the realization that they didn't have much time left, he turned to Leora. "Get ready," he said, his voice low and urgent. "When I open this, we move fast and stay low." Leora didn't respond, but her body was already in motion, her eyes scanning the room one last time, as if memorizing it in case they didn't make it out alive. Michael pushed the false wall aside and gestured for her to follow him through the narrow tunnel that awaited them beyond. The dim light from the outpost barely illuminated the path ahead. They were not out of danger yet, and Michael knew that the real fight had only just begun. The tunnel was dark and narrow, the air stale, as if it hadn't been used in years. The walls were covered in grime and the floor uneven. But Michael didn't hesitate. He moved swiftly and silently, each step calculated to make as little noise as possible. Leora was right behind him, her footsteps soft, but sure. She was surprisingly quiet for someone so used to luxurious surroundings. No doubt she had been trained for moments like this, though the tension between them was thick. Her earlier defiance still clung to her like a cloak. They moved in silence for what felt like an eternity. The only sounds were their breathing and the faint rustling of their movements. The tunnel stretched on endlessly with no clear end in sight. Michael tried to keep his mind focused, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the chaos outside, to the mercenaries closing in on them, and the uncertainty of what awaited them at the end of this tunnel. Leora's voice broke the silence, her words low but urgent. "How far does this tunnel go?" Michael didn't answer right away. He couldn't afford to get distracted, not now, not when they were so close to their only chance at survival. But after a few moments he spoke, his voice steady, but tinged with doubt. "I'm not sure. It wasn't marked on any of the maps I've seen, but it's our best shot. We just need to keep moving." They continued onward with no clear direction, just the hope that the tunnel would eventually lead them to safety. Each twist and turn felt like a step further into the unknown, but Michael knew they couldn't afford to turn back now. The outpost was no longer safe, and they couldn't risk getting caught by the mercenaries, who were no doubt scouring the area. Leora moved ahead of him for a brief moment, her back straight, and her face set in determination. Despite the grime on her clothes and the dirt smudging her face, she looked every bit the princess she was born to be. But there was something more there, something realer than the polished image she projected in the halls of her father's palace. Michael caught a glimpse of it in her eyes before she turned away, the vulnerability beneath the surface, the fear she'd been so careful to hide. They came to a fork in the tunnel, and Michael paused, his instincts telling him to stop and listen. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The tunnel ahead seemed to dip into even darker shadows, the air colder and more oppressive. The faintest hint of a sound came from the direction they had been heading, voices muffled but distinct. "We're not alone," Michael whispered, the words almost too softly to be heard. Leora froze, her eyes scanning the darkness around them, her expression unreadable, but Michael could see the flicker of alarm in her gaze. "What do you mean?" "I heard something." Michael's voice was low but urgent. "We need to move, but we need to be careful." They crept forward as quietly as they could, moving toward the sound, the tension growing with every step, their breaths shallow, their bodies tense, ready for whatever was waiting ahead. As they rounded a corner, Michael felt a hand on his arm and turned to find Leora standing beside him, her face closer than he expected, her breath a soft whisper against his ear. "I need to know something," she said, her voice almost too quiet to hear, but Michael could hear the seriousness in her words. "Are we going to make it out of here?" He turned to face her fully, her eyes locked onto his, searching, as if looking for something in him to reassure her. But all he could offer was the truth, even though he didn't want to say it. "I don't know, Princess, but we'll give it everything we've got." For a moment, neither of them spoke, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared understanding, something that had grown between them over the past hours, something deeper than simple duty or obligation. In that moment, there were two people fighting for survival, not a princess and her guard, but equals, both bound by circumstance and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Leora nodded slowly, her expression softening ever so slightly. Then let's keep moving. They continued down the tunnel with renewed determination, each step bringing them closer to whatever awaited them in the darkness ahead. But there was no turning back now, no way to go but forward. The mercenaries were closing in, and they had to keep moving before the enemies found their trail. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, the darkness seemed to press in on them from all sides, the air thicker, the silence oppressive. But Michael couldn't afford to focus on that. He had to stay focused on Leora and the path ahead. The only thing that mattered was getting them both out alive, no matter what it took. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in around them with each step they took. The air was colder now, and Michael could feel the weight of it pressing down on his chest, his every breath a little more labored. The silence was broken only by their footsteps and the faint rustle of their clothing as they moved forward, each step a desperate attempt to outrun the danger that was closing in behind them. Leora was still beside him, her face set in determination, but Michael could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands clenched at her sides, as if holding back the fear that threatened to overtake her. But she didn't show it, not outwardly. She remained composed, almost too composed, as if she was still trying to maintain that image of the perfect princess, the untouchable leader that the galaxy expected her to be. But Michael saw through it. The cracks in her facade were starting to show, and he couldn't help but wonder if they were both just pretending to be something they weren't. They reached another junction in the tunnel, and Michael held up his hand, signaling for them to stop. His senses were on high alert, and he listened carefully. The faintest sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor ahead, but there was something else too, the unmistakable hum of energy weapons charging. He turned to Leora, his voice barely a whisper. "They're ahead. We need to find another way." Leora nodded quickly, her expression shifting from one of royal composure to the steely resolve of someone who knew the weight of survival better than most. She didn't ask questions, she just followed his lead without hesitation. The princess was proving herself to be more than just a symbol of power. She was a force to be reckoned with, and in that moment, Michael felt a grudging respect for her that he hadn't expected to feel. They moved quickly down a side passage, hoping to avoid the mercenaries ahead, but the tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, and with every turn they made, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded toward a dead end. As if the walls were closing in around them, there was no way out and no way forward except to fight their way through. Leora stopped for a moment, her face reflecting a mix of frustration and fear. "How much further do you think we have to go?" Michael glanced around, taking in their surroundings, the dim light from their small flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. The walls were jagged and uneven, the tunnel claustrophobic, but he didn't have the answers to her questions. No map, no clear plan. All they had was instinct and the hope that they could survive long enough to escape. "I don't know," he said, his voice low and strained, "but we keep moving until we find a way out." Leora didn't respond, but her pace quickened as if she too had decided that there was no other option but forward. Michael followed her every step of the way, every sense alert as they moved through the labyrinthine tunnels, that every movement becoming more desperate with each passing second. The tunnel began to slope downward at a sharp angle, and Michael's instincts told him to slow down, to be more cautious. But there was no time for caution. Now they couldn't afford to waste any more precious minutes. The mercenaries were close, and every moment spent waiting could be their last. As they descended deeper into the earth, the air grew thicker and more oppressive. The darkness seemed to swallow them whole, and Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they were being pulled into the very heart of the enemy's trap. The walls seemed to close in around them with every step, making the space feel even smaller, the claustrophobia building as they descended further. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet trembled, a distant rumble, like something massive moving above them, and Michael instinctively grabbed Leora's arm, pulling her closer as if shielding her from the unseen danger ahead. "Get ready," he said, his voice barely audible above the sound of the rumble. We needed to move faster. Leora's eyes met his, her face pale, but determined. I won't stop, she whispered. Michael nodded briefly before urging her forward. They had no choice but to keep going. The danger was closing in, and they were running out of time. They reached the bottom of the slope, and Michael's heart sank as they found themselves at the entrance to a cavern the size of a small city. The walls were jagged and uneven, but the most alarming thing was the large metal door embedded into the far wall. It was old but clearly still functional, and Michael could see the faint glow of security lights around the edges of the door. Someone had been here recently. He turned to Leora, his voice tight. This is it, the way out. We need to get through that door. Leora didn't hesitate. She nodded and began to move toward it. But as they approached, Michael's senses flared, and he instinctively reached out, pulling her back, just as a series of laser beams flickered to life across the cavern, their bright red lines crisscrossing the entrance like a deadly web. The beams of light sliced through the air around them, sharp and precise, each red line glinting with deadly intent. Michael instinctively pulled Leora back into the shadows of the tunnel, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing. The last thing they needed was to trigger a security system that would lock them in this cavern forever, or worse, alert the mercenaries to their position. Leora's breath was shallow and quick as she looked up at him, her eyes wide with realization. She took a half step back, as if she was about to speak, but Michael raised a hand to silence her. "Don't move," he whispered, his voice low, and controlled his eyes, scanning the beams and the surrounding area, trying to map out the best way forward. "We need to figure out how to disable these, or we'll be trapped here." They both stood frozen in the dark for a moment, neither of them willing to make a move, but Michael's mind was already working through the possibilities. A security system had to have a weak point somewhere. There had to be a way around it, or at least a way to get them past it before it triggered an alarm. "Think," he muttered under his breath as his gaze flicked from the door to the beams of light, and back again. Leora was still beside him, waiting for instructions, her face tense, but alert. Even now, in the midst of danger, she wasn't panicking, she was thinking, and that made all the difference. "Can we hack it?" she asked quietly after a long moment, her voice full of urgency but devoid of panic. Michael shook his head slightly. "Not unless you've got a datapad on you and the skills to match." Leora's lips pressed into a thin line, but then she nodded slowly. "Then we find another way." He could see the determination in her eyes, and that was all the encouragement he needed. Without another word, he crouched down at the edge of the cavern where the shadows were deepest and began to carefully edge toward the beams, his eyes flicking from one laser line to the next. He needed to find the gaps between them. He needed to find a way through without triggering the alarm. The closer they got, the more intense the lights became, and Michael could feel the heat from the lasers, even though they were still a few meters away, each being a reminder of how close they were to disaster. The sound of his own heartbeat in his ears drowned out everything else, and his every instinct told him to retreat, but he couldn't afford to do that. They were too close. Leora stayed behind him, silent but watchful. He could feel her presence like a weight against his back. She was waiting for him to make the next move, and he wasn't going to let her down, not now, not when they were so close. He moved again, inching his way toward the next gap between the beams, his body low to the ground, and every muscle taut with tension. He held his breath as he passed through the first gap, and then the second, the beams humming just inches from his skin, his heart thudding in his chest with every step. One more move, and he would be at the door, just one more, but the tension was almost unbearable. Every time he moved forward, the risk of triggering the security system increased, and he could hear the faint hum of something else in the distance. It was too quiet. The mercenaries could be anywhere now, and if they heard the alarms going off, it was over. He reached a final gap and turned back to look at Leora, her eyes locked on his, waiting for the signal. He gave her a quick nod, and then with a final push, he slid through the last laser line and into the open space in front of the door. The door was massive, a slab of metal that looked old but sturdy, and it was clear that whatever force had created this outpost had intended for it to be impregnable. Michael's mind raced as he approached it. "All right," he said breathlessly, "now we get through this." He scanned the area around the door, looking for a terminal or any sort of panel that could be used to open it. But there was nothing visible, no keycard slot, no security code, just the cold metal surface staring back at him. Leora stepped forward, her expression hardening as she studied the door. "There's got to be a way," she muttered under her breath. "We can't be trapped here." Michael turned back to her, his voice steady, but filled with urgency. "We're not trapped, not yet, but we need to act fast before they catch up to us." He turned to the wall beside the door and began feeling around it with his hands, searching for anything that might help them bypass the security and open the door. But there was nothing, no hidden controls, no panel to work with, just the cold stone and metal around them. Then he heard a faint clicking sound followed by a hiss and a low groan of metal as the door began to shift slightly. Michael's eyes widened, and he pulled Leora back instinctively as the door creaked open just enough to reveal a dimly lit corridor beyond it. Was their only way out, but it wasn't a guarantee that it would lead them to safety. "We need to move now," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. The door opened just wide enough to reveal a dark corridor beyond, the dim light flickering overhead, casting long shadows across the floor. Michael didn't hesitate. He grabbed Leora's arm and pulled her forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of time pressing down on them. The mercenaries were too close now, and there was no telling how long the door would stay open. Leora stumbled slightly as she followed him, but she didn't break her stride, her eyes darting around the narrow hallway, her breath shallow and quick. But her composure remained intact. They were in this together now, and there was no turning back. They moved quickly down the corridor, the air colder and thicker with each step. The walls seemed to close in around them, the tunnel narrowing. As they went deeper into the facility, Michael's senses were on high alert. Every sound amplified, the faint hum of the lights above, the soft patter of their footsteps, and the distant echo of something else, something that made his skin crawl. He stopped suddenly, his instincts screaming at him to stay alert. Leora bumped into his back, and he held up a hand, signaling for her to stop too, his eyes scanning the corridor ahead. "Something's not right," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the silence. Leora didn't respond, but Michael could feel her tension grow, her body rigid. As she waited for him to make the next move, he could sense her fear, but she didn't show it, her face hard and focused as she silently followed his lead. They continued moving, but at a slower pace, now their steps more cautious, Michael's every nerve on edge. Something was out of place. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The silence was oppressive, too quiet for a facility like this. Something was lurking in the shadows. Then they heard it, the sound of footsteps echoing from behind them, a soft shuffle at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Michael's heart leaped into his throat. They weren't alone anymore. The mercenaries had found them. "Go," he hissed, grabbing Leora's arm again and pulling her into a faster pace down the corridor, the sound of their pursuers growing louder as they pushed forward. Leora didn't question him. She simply kept moving, her face set with determination. But Michael could see the flicker of fear in her eyes. She was still a princess, underneath all the training, all the strength. But in that moment, she was running for her life just like him. The corridors stretched on forever, the walls closing in around them with every step. But Michael refused to let the fear take hold. He focused on the task ahead, finding an escape, finding a way out of this hellhole. They couldn't afford to stop, not until they were safely away from the mercenaries. They rounded a corner and Michael skidded to a stop, his mind racing as he took in the scene in front of them. The hallway opened up into a large chamber, the walls lined with strange machines and equipment that hummed with life. There was a door on the far side of the room, but it was heavily guarded. 2 mercenaries stood in front of it, their weapons drawn, ready for any sign of trouble. Michael cursed under his breath. They were trapped again, and this time there was no way around them, no way to sneak past without being seen. Leora's voice was a whisper, but it was filled with resolve. "What do we do now?" Michael's mind raced. He had only seconds to make a decision. The mercenaries were already closing in on them from both sides, and if they didn't move fast, they'd be caught in a crossfire. There was only one option. "Follow my lead," he muttered, his hand instinctively going to the sidearm holstered at his hip, the gun cold against his palm. But it was the only weapon they had right now, and it was better than nothing. He turned to Leora, his gaze meeting hers for a brief moment, his voice low and urgent. "When I say go, you run straight for the door, and don't stop until you're through, got it?" Leora didn't hesitate this time. She simply nodded and shifted into a ready stance, her eyes locked onto the door as she prepared to sprint. Michael's finger rested lightly on the trigger as he surveyed the mercenaries ahead. They hadn't noticed them yet, but it wouldn't be long before they did. He counted down in his head, and when the moment came, he moved. Without warning, he sprang from the Shadow's gun, raised his first shot, hitting one of the mercenaries square in the chest. The man dropped instantly, but the second mercenary reacted faster than Michael had anticipated, his weapon already trained on them. "Go now," Michael shouted to Leora as he fired again, missing his target this time, but creating enough of a distraction for her to move. Leora didn't need a second invitation. She sprinted forward with terrifying speed, her movements fluid and graceful, but determined. Michael's heart raced as he covered her retreat, keeping his focus on the remaining mercenary, who was now frantically trying to get a shot off at them. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire and the metallic clang of ricocheting bullets as Michael kept the mercenary's attention on him, giving Leora the time she needed to reach the door. She was almost there, only a few more steps, and she would be through, but the mercenary wasn't backing down. He was closing in on Michael now. Come on," Michael muttered under his breath, his finger tight on the trigger. Leora reached the door just as Michael fired again, his shot narrowly missing the mercenary's shoulder, but it was enough to buy her a few extra seconds. She slammed her palm against the door's control panel, and it hissed open just as a mercenary aimed his weapon at Michael. "Move," Michael shouted just as the door slid wide enough for Leora to duck inside. She didn't need to be told twice. She threw herself into the small opening, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she tumbled into the room beyond the door. Michael followed closely behind, but not before he fired one last shot at the mercenary who had been closing in on them. The bullet grazed the man's arm, forcing him to stagger back. The door slammed shut with a resounding thud just as Michael ducked inside. He didn't pause to look back. He could hear the mercenaries on the other side scrambling to get through, but the door was solid and thick enough to keep them out for now. Leora was already up and moving, her eyes scanning the new room they had entered. It was smaller than the chamber they had just come from, but the air was different, fresher, almost as if this area was better maintained. The walls were lined with panels and pipes running across the ceiling, but there were no immediate signs of danger. "Where are we now?" Leora asked, her voice strained, but she was trying to keep calm as she caught her breath. Michael didn't answer right away. He was focused on the door, trying to figure out how long they had before the mercenaries could find a way through, but it was clear they had bought themselves some time, not enough to rest but enough to regroup. "Not sure," he said, finally glancing around the room, his gaze landing on a console near the far wall. It was old and dusty, but it looked like it had been used recently. There was a faint hum coming from it, as if it was still connected to the facility's main system. If he could get to it, maybe they could find a way to escape. Leora noticed his gaze and followed his line of sight. "Do you think you can access it?" Michael hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I think so, but we'll need to be quick. I don't know how long this room will stay secure." Leora didn't wait for further instruction. She moved toward the console without hesitation, her movements fluid and purposeful. Michael followed closely behind, but his eyes never left the door as his mind raced, trying to anticipate their next move. Leora reached the console and quickly began scanning the interface, her fingers moving over the old keys with surprising skill. Michael watched her for a moment before stepping back toward the door, keeping an eye on the small window set into it. He could hear the mercenaries on the other side still trying to break through, but so far there was no sign that they had found a way in. "We're running out of time," he muttered to himself. Leora's voice cut through his thoughts. "I've got access to the facility's maps and exit routes, but it's not much. This place is a maze." Michael turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "Is there a way out?" She looked at him for a moment before nodding. "There's a maintenance exit about 2 levels down, but it's heavily guarded. It might be our best shot, but we'll need to get through a few more security checkpoints to reach it." "How long will that take?" Michael asked his patience wearing thin, but he was doing his best to keep his composure for both their sakes. Leora tapped a few more keys, bringing up a new set of data, her eyes scanning quickly before she responded, maybe 20 minutes if we're lucky. Michael felt a knot form in his stomach. We don't have that long. I know, Leora replied, her voice firm and resolute, but it's the only option we have. Michael turned back to the door once more as the sound of footsteps grew louder on the other side. They were getting closer, and he could hear the faint sounds of a battering ram being positioned. "All right," he said, his voice steady despite the urgency in his chest. "We go through the maintenance exit, but we move fast, no hesitation." Leora nodded in agreement and immediately began setting the coordinates on the console. "I'll get the doors unlocked and reroute the security systems to buy us some time, but you'll need to cover me." Michael's eyes hardened as he drew his weapon again, his fingers tightening around the handle. "I'll make sure no one follows us." They were running out of time, and the mercenaries were closing in, but for the first time since they had started this escape, Michael felt a flicker of hope deep within him. Maybe they could make it out of here alive, but only if they stuck together and stayed ahead of their enemies. He glanced over at Leora, who was focused intently on the console, her fingers moving rapidly, but with precision. "Let's make this count," he said under his breath, his heart pounding as he prepared for what would come next. The hum of the console was the only sound that filled the small room as Leora continued to work her fingers, moving swiftly over the controls, her focus unwavering. Michael could hear the faint crackle of footsteps on the other side of the door. The mercenaries were getting closer, and the tension was thick enough to cut through with a knife. Every second felt like an eternity. "How much longer?" Michael asked, his voice low, but tinged with urgency, his eyes scanning the door and the narrow hallway outside. Leora didn't look up, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Just a few more seconds," she said, her voice steady, though Michael could hear the strain in it. He gripped his weapon tighter, his gaze flicking between the door and the console, his mind racing. They had to make it out of here. They couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. Not when they were so close. He could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins and the sharp edge of fear gnawing at his gut, but he pushed it down. Focus was all that mattered now. The sound of the mercenaries grew louder, the unmistakable clang of boots echoing against the metal floor as they rushed down the hall toward the door, the steady rhythm of their march, a countdown ticking away. Leora finally looked up, her face pale but determined. "I've unlocked the maintenance routes, they're open, but we'll need to move fast. The nearest exit is only 2 levels down, but it's going to be a scramble to get there." Michael nodded without hesitation. "We don't have time for anything else, let's go." The door behind them shuddered as another hit landed on it. The mercenaries were almost through, and Michael could feel the tension in the air like a live wire. He didn't wait another second. He grabbed Leora's arm and pulled her toward the exit, her heels scraping against the floor as she followed him. Without a word, they were moving as fast as they could, the pressure mounting with every step. They passed through a narrow hallway that led to a small lift hidden in the corner of the room. Michael punched the button, and the lift doors opened with a soft whoosh. The space was cramped, barely enough room for the two of them, but there was no time to worry about comfort. "Level 2, Leora said, her voice clipped and focused as she hit the button for the corresponding floor. The doors slid shut and the lift hummed to life as it began its descent. The sound of the mercenaries pounding on the door above them grew fainter, but Michael knew it was only a matter of time before they realized where they had gone. He could already feel the sweat gathering at his temples, the pressure mounting as they descended deeper into the bowels of the facility. The lift seemed to take an eternity to reach its destination, the seconds stretching into what felt like hours, but eventually the doors slid open with a soft chime, and they were greeted by the dim light of the lower level. Leora stepped out first, her eyes scanning the area ahead of them. The hallway was empty for now, but Michael knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. "Where to?" Michael asked, his voice low and steady, but his senses on high alert. Leora glanced down at the small device she had been carrying with her since the beginning. She tapped it once and a map of the facility appeared on the screen. "We're close now," she said. "The exit is just ahead, but there's a guard checkpoint in the way. We'll need to take them out if we want to get through unnoticed." Michael's mind raced. He could feel the weight of the gun in his hand, the only weapon between them and a group of armed mercenaries. "How many are there?" he asked. "3, maybe 4, Leora answered, her voice calm, but Michael could hear the sharpness in it. They had no time to waste. "Then we take them out quietly," he said, his tone decisive. "We move fast, we hit hard, and we don't let them raise the alarm." Leora nodded, her eyes flashing with determination. "I'm ready." Michael took a deep breath as he adjusted his grip on his weapon. They couldn't afford to fail, not now. They were so close to the exit, and every step felt like a countdown to freedom, but he couldn't let his guard down, not even for a moment. They moved silently through the hallway, the walls cold and unyielding around them, the faint sound of footsteps approaching from up ahead. Michael motioned for Leora to stop and crouched down beside him. He peered around the corner and saw the 4 guards stationed at the checkpoint, their weapons slung over their shoulders, their attention focused elsewhere. "On my mark," Michael whispered to Leora. "We take them down together. Stay close and move fast." Leora gave him a single nod, her face set in a look of fierce determination. 3, 2, 1, go, Michael hissed, and in a blur of motion they sprang from their hiding places. Michael took the first guard down quickly, a swift strike to the throat that left the man gasping for air before he collapsed to the floor. Leora was right behind him, using her speed and precision to take out the second guard with a well-placed punch to the back of his head. The third guard barely had time to react before he was incapacitated by a well-aimed shot from Michael's sidearm. The 4th guard was turning toward them just as Michael lunged forward, knocking the man off his feet and silencing him with a quick strike to the neck. The hallway was quiet once again, the guards lying unconscious on the floor. Leora stood over the last guard, her chest rising and falling with exertion, but her face remained calm and collected. "That was fast," she said, her voice steady. Michael nodded. "We don't have time to waste." They hurried toward the exit, the door sliding open just ahead of them, and beyond it Michael saw the faint outline of freedom, the night sky visible through the cracks in the door. They had made it. They were out of the facility and into the open air, but the danger was far from over. The mercenaries would be on their trail soon enough, but for now they had a brief moment of victory. Leora turned to Michael, her face softening for the first time in what felt like hours. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "I didn't think we'd make it out." Michael glanced at her with a faint smile. "We're not out of the woods yet, but we will be," he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "Let's get moving."